That's called my favorite expression. It's a game changer. Every time when I'm asking guests, it's like, is it the game changer? It's like, oh, I don't like to use game changer. But there's one thing as a non-pilot question I would like to ask you. One of my few friends been trained on F-16, and when sometimes on our rare communication, and then I was asking, how about this, how about that, the challenges, this and that. And there's something I know there are a lot of speculation they had problems with English. Some did, some didn't. So that's the truth, what I was told. And the other thing, the guy who didn't have problem with English or anything, he says it's totally different mentality. It's like driving on the other side of the road. And he says that for some, there were a challenge when you fly and you have this radio talk. And he says sometimes it's a challenge. And I don't understand why. What sort of peculiarity of that? You know, I would expect as a person who doesn't fly the planes, all the buttons, you know, keep straight, you know, take the target, but not actually talking. Why talking can be a challenge?
So most of a military flying is not about what's happening in your cockpit. It's about what they call situational awareness. It's a three-dimensional game of chess that's happening ahead of you. Where is your wingman? Where is the air-to-air refueling tanker? Where is the intelligence-gathering aircraft that's providing you intelligence to the battlefield? Where is your target? Where are the Russian aircraft? That is a three-dimensional. Now, one of the things that you use to paint that picture is your radar. One of the things you do is something called data link, where it's a bit like the internet of the sky, where your aircraft radar is looking at another aircraft and you know that he's looking at you, but he's sending me that picture. So you don't know I'm here and you don't know that I know where you are. And that's the benefit of having data link. And part of the data link is automatic. Part of the data link, you have to ask for intelligence.
Paces 1 hot. Look for heat. Nose 25 hot. Paces 1 hot. Konya 2. Fox 3.
And the final bit is that you need to be listening to get situational awareness from what's happening around you. So in the Harrier, when I flew, you had 2 radio boxes that were on all the time. So you had 2 different radio frequencies with stuff going on all the time.
Gosh, distracting.
And some of it was English, some of it was American. I know it should be the same, but it's not. Some of it was NATO colleagues who would generally speak English, but in excitement would suddenly go blah, 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 off into a different language altogether. And, of course, it's not like you and I chatting with a quality microphone. You're hearing things through a mask and through the airways and then through your helmet. So it's really difficult to pick up every word, and you're trying to pick up the sense of what's going on. You're busy, and every now and again, what you're trying to do is filter something that's really important. So you hear a key word and go, oh, say again. Oh, got it. Now that's difficult enough for me as an English speaker, native English speaker, who's flown jets all his life. Now try and put that into the Ukrainians. And why it's important is I've been asked several times, well, surely Ukrainians, they're flying in Ukraine airspace. Why do they have to speak English? Surely they just speak Ukrainian. They're just talking to each other. That would be true if the only people they were needing to talk to were Ukrainians. Situational awareness, where the Russians are, where they're getting airborne, what they're doing, is what an airborne early warning radar does. Big aircraft that look out over the whole battlefield, paint a picture, and then allow you to zoom in on parts of that picture. Western assets that are not flying over Ukraine, but are flying on the Ukraine border, are looking out across the whole of Ukraine. They are collecting a picture, not only a radar picture, but also an electronic warfare picture, an infrared picture. There are satellites looking down. All of that information can now be fed to your Ukrainian pilots so that, in a nice simple world, I'm a fighter jet, you're a Russian. I know it's uncomfortable. Let's have the other way around. Let's make you the Ukrainian, I'll be the Russian. So generally, for fighter pilots, it's he who sees first wins. You don't see using your eyes, you see using the radar. So I'm the big bad Russian. As soon as I turn my radar on, it sends a ping out towards your aircraft that bounces back, and I can measure how far you are away.
Gosh.
But as soon as that ping hits you, your aircraft listens to it and goes, somebody's looking at me. And you can analyze that bit of electronics and work out who's looking at you. Now, you can imagine that I send a ping to you. The further I have to send it, the weaker the signal is. Then it's got to bounce off your aircraft and come all the way back again. So my aircraft, you're going to know about me looking for you before I know you're there. Because the further out you look, the less likely that ping is going to make it all the way back to my radar. So you don't want to turn on your radar unless you really have to. But the Russians are looking out, where are the Ukrainians? Now, if you don't want to turn your radar on, because as soon as you do, you're telling me where you are.
So actually, I can be invisible.
Yes. But how do you know where I am?
Because I have friends, Western friends, and
Western
they spy
friends,
on everyone.
And they are looking at me. They tell you where I am. You now electronically plot that on your little radar.
And press the button and go, pew.
How does it go?
Press the
That's
button.
a special Ukrainian missile. Pew! but in principle, that's how you can do it. So all of a sudden, the Russian doesn't know he's being targeted because you haven't turned on your radar, but you're using the West. Now, to coordinate that, it might sound complicated to the viewers here. Just imagine what it feels like when you're in the cockpit in an aircraft that you're not really familiar with, and you're needing to listen to all of this stuff going on through crackly radios with Western English being spoken, with lots of people trying to get on the radio. Incredibly difficult to do, and that's why it's really important that the language is understood. And it's not being able to go into a bar in London and order a drink. It's being able to understand the crisp and specific words.
Big old shooting star just now right in front of the jet. It's cool.
Did you make a wish?
Not yet. I'll think of one.
To help your situational awareness so that you can exploit your aircraft as effectively as you can do.
Yeah, your ears need to get used to it. I remember when I arrived to this country and there was something bank related. I had a call and I had to do activation or something. And the person on the phone was with Scottish accent. She repeated 11 times, and there was something like your passport number, something like, I nearly cried, because I understand I can't hang up, because it's vital for me. And I don't understand what she's saying. And it's, as non-native speaker, it is very challenging audio. I didn't realize that aspect.
Yeah, and it's not just the audio, I say, it's just the nature of the environment. And it's so important because it's not about, they can fly the aeroplane, they can operate those aircraft, but Western air power is not about that aircraft. It's working as a team because the team elements of that make you a lot more effective and a lot more survivable.
So basically, it's a F-16, if we sort of like simplify it, it's a modern computer which can fly. And so you can be part of this game. My question is, Ukraine destroyed 2 Russia's A-50, these intelligence aircrafts. And theoretically, I understand it's a big thing, and especially it was very complicated and difficult operation. And I think it was 5 of them Russia had, and sort of like not all of them were working, but Ukraine took 2 down. How important and how significant it is?
I think it was very, very significant. I mean, the numbers, one of the things that's difficult sometimes in the numbers game is that Russia, for example, I don't have the numbers to hand, but I think they built around 20 A-50s. But as you say, some become unserviceable, some get crashed, some are long-term not working. It's often very difficult to work out how many are actually available, particularly because if you were the boss of the Russian base with the A-50s there and you're funded to keep 10 serviceable all the time, are you going to admit that only 8 are serviceable?
No, in Russia probably not.
No, and therefore how it might be you've only got 2 serviceable or 3 or 5. But I think there's around about 10 that they expected to be serviceable, and it appears that Russia's lost 2 of them. That's quite significant loss. Now, will it affect Russia's military capability? Not really. What it does do is it means they have to be even more careful. And actually, one thing that we tend to forget is that Russia they don't train very often on their A-50. The A-50 is packed full of specialists who are sat in front of their computer screens, twiddling things and learn. They don't often get training. So the ones that are flying in the war are probably the most experienced that Russia has. If you've shot down 2 of those, they don't carry parachutes and they don't have ejection seats. So all of the crews will have died. That's where it hurts Russia, because they've suddenly lost some very good operators who know how to get the best out of their equipment, that know how to get situational awareness. That's what really hurts you. But for the time being, all it means is Russia's just a bit more careful. I think what's been clever, though, again, is a really good example of where Ukraine has used things like the Patriot missile system. Again, if I want to shoot you down, your aircraft is a big aircraft, an A-50, lots of people. So you've got lots of sensors on the aircraft that listen and watch for any radar that's lighting you up so you can run away. And you also stay far enough away that you've got time to run away even further. If you're clever, though, about not you turning on your radar or using a radar that's a long way away to provide that information to a missile system that can then fire at you that's very close to you, and the missile system only turns on its radar when it's quite close to you, that's how you shoot down aircraft out of the sky. Russia doesn't make the same mistake again. Remember the Moskva?
Yeah,
that got,
of course.
Yeah. So that was an interesting story there. And so how did the Russians lose a very modern ship in the Black Sea? Now, reports suggest that the crew were actually not that capable, that they were driving their boat in a racetrack pattern, a very predictable racetrack pattern. So the Ukrainians have Neptune missiles, but those Neptune missiles would have been shot out of the sky by the Moskva. And you can't just fire the Neptune missiles in the general direction of a ship and turn on the radar nearby, because you won't know where that ship will be. However, if it is driving in a very predictable racetrack pattern, and you know how long it takes the missile to get from its launch point to that space, you know where the ship will be when the missile gets there.
So fingers crossed and hope for luck.
So you literally launch 2 or 3 missiles at a specific point in the ground on the sea, where the ship isn't there, but it will be there once the missiles get to it. Last minute, the missiles turn on their radar.
Hello.
And it was successful.
Yeah.
Now, none of that should have happened from a Russian perspective. Lots of reasons are failures, but it was a great example of Ukraine being incredibly clever and innovative.
And again, the talent to surprise.
Yes. And force. I mean, Ukraine doesn't have a navy, and yet it's managed to push the Russian navy out of the Black Sea. That is an incredible success.
Yes, you see, and that's why sort of like the positive way is not necessarily being naive. You know, it's something which I think it's the whole drive, the whole, if you summarize what's happening, I mean, taking aside atrocities, loss, and all the horrible things, there's a lot of nice and pleasant surprises. Otherwise, you know, because you corrected me, but I think from the military perspective, if you count everything, look at objectively at everything, Ukraine would be already occupied, Russia would dominate, and there's no chance, by any look at it. But we have, lots of surprises. We have lots of innovations, and Ukraine still stand. And there is no Kiev in 3 days, is it?
No, and I agree with you. I think we have to be careful, though. I think we reported on Russian submarines getting sunk, Russian ships being sunk, boarding craft being sunk, and lots of, this is fantastic, this shows that we're on the front foot. And you say, it's an irritation to Russia, but the only metric of success in this war is progress on the battlefield. And therefore, whilst I think it's brilliant that Ukraine is doing it, but the danger is it's a bit like wasps at a picnic. They're irritating, but they're not going to stop you eating your picnic. And the fact that Ukraine has managed to get its grain exports going again, where I think it'll be interesting, the Navy question, is that as a military guy, how do you stop Russia? And we talk about centres of gravity in the military, and a Russian centre of gravity is something that Russia will not want to lose. Now, Crimea is probably something that Russia would not want to lose. The port of Sevastopol, the historical significance of it. Now, it's very unlikely that Ukraine would be able to take Crimea militarily. But if it was to do it, it would need to stop the Russian Navy protecting the shoreline. And Ukraine has managed to get rid of the Russian Navy. It would also have to demonstrate that it could sever the Kerch Road Bridge to stop the resupplies coming over. Ukraine's done that as well. You'd also have to take out the headquarters of the Navy on Crimea.
Yeah.
It's done that as well. You'd also have to take out the air defence systems that are on Crimea.
Tick.
It's done that as well. So all of these things are going to, if they're causing me to think about it, they will have caused Putin to think about it. Is this actually a clever Ukrainian plan? Rather than being an irritation, little things that are happening, is this part of a grand plan? Because if they were to secure Crimea, that would be defeat for Russia.
Do you know, there's Budanov's statement yesterday, I think. I don't know if you've seen it. He was saying that it's easier to take Crimea than Donbas region. And he was saying, like, through historical perspective, there are sort of many countries or many empires were trying to take Crimea, but they were not able to hold to it. And he mentioned there are two points of grounds where you enter in, and you're this, you're doing that. And knowing that Donbass is priority for Russia to take over, and they consider the Crimea is already there. So let's see.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of reasons why Crimea is very difficult to attack, just geographically. But given that with the right set of weapons, with the right set of capability...
And passion.
And bravery and courage, maybe. But if it failed, you'd have to throw a lot of resources at it. And if it failed, that would be really damaging for Ukraine. So it would be a very high-risk operation.
Well, let's see. Look, one of the tasks we mentioned about F-16, but listening to other experts, I also understand, and General Syrskyi, the commander of Ukraine Armed Forces, he was saying the fighter jets F-16 won't get closer than 40 kilometers to the front line or to the Russian border. I don't remember. But one of the tasks not to be targeted by Russian air defense system or Russian pilots, but also to destroy the Russian air defense system. And I understand it requires more skills than just operate the jet. Is it true? And is it sort of like one of the challenging points for the pilot?
Yes, as soon as you go... So as a pilot, it's difficult enough flying this aeroplane, but as soon as you go into a threat environment with different radar systems looking at you, and that puts a warning up in your cockpit. And it's not normally just one. If you're getting near the Russian border, that's where Russia has all of its air defense systems. So all of these different radars will be lighting you up. That's not only very scary and distracting, it's also very dangerous. And bluntly, the Russian air defense system are very good, and the F-16s are quite old technology. Now, as we said, we don't know how much the software has been updated, so it's very difficult to know how capable they would be. But the likelihood is you wouldn't want to fly the jets anywhere near that environment because you're very likely to get shot down, and it's very distracting for the pilots. The other thing you have to be careful of is that your own system's shooting you down. So in the Iraq War, we were operating our military jets going north into Baghdad. But most Western pilots were far more worried about the Patriot system of the US when we came back into Kuwait shooting us down than we were ever worried about the Iraqi.
Isn't it visible that it's one of yours?
Yeah, but first of all, jets fly quite fast. Mm-hmm. Secondly, the guys who are operating these systems often are fire first, ask questions later. And if you're on a confusing front line, which is the middle of a battlefield, how well trained are the Ukrainian soldiers who are in control of whether it's handheld missile systems, whether it's a gun system, whether it's a surface-to-air missile system? It's not operating their own language. They're not experts at using it. And the danger is they see a jet whistling along. Ah, it's fire. Oh, it's one of ours. Oh. So it's a very integrating your air power into your battlefield is a really important factor, because otherwise there's a grave risk that you'll shoot down your own aircraft. There's lots of reports that the Russians have lost over 10% of their Air Force assets, and around 10% of those that they've lost to their own fire, that they've shot them down themselves. And that's not unusual, unfortunately. So Ukraine would want to be really careful. It's not an unusual thing. In the fog of war, they call it, with jets flying around at 600 miles an hour, people on the ground having very little time to make an assessment. So integrating. That's another reason why you probably wouldn't have the F-16s operating in that really difficult environment where the Russians are going to shoot you down, and there's a danger your own people will as well.
What do you think of effectiveness of Western air defense system engaged by Ukrainian operators?
That's a great question, and I think it's a slightly broader question than just the air defense systems. One of the things that the West has been nervous about is to give Ukraine its state-of-the-art weapons. Technology is our asymmetric advantage in the West. So where Putin has used hypersonic missiles, the Kinzhal, probably never used before. I've got these missiles that nobody can shoot down. But it provides a great way for the West to work out how to shoot them down. Mm. And actually, we can shoot them down. The West does not want to showcase its state-of-the-art military capability. It needs to protect that capability for the day it needs it. So whilst Russia would say that the West doesn't have hypersonic missiles, I'm pretty confident we do have hypersonic missiles.
We just don't advertise it.
We just don't advertise it, because why would we tell our potential enemies what we've got? So the point being is that things like long-range missiles, we're very reluctant to give our latest generation. So a good example of this is the Storm Shadow missile, which is a long-range missile that we gave Ukraine several hundred of them. And it's very capable. It flies long distances, and it's proved quite effective. But we in this country have had that missile for about 30 years. Again, 30 years ago, what was technology like? What's happened in the interim? Massive advances in technology. And the West, we had bought, I think, 1,000 of these Storm Shadows initially at about 2 million each, £2 million each. We'd only used about 150 in that 30 years, and therefore we were going to upgrade them. But we decided we didn't need 1,000. We only needed about 350 to be upgraded. So what do you do with the rest? You either pay industry to decommission them, cost you money. You store them, cost you money. Or you give them to Ukraine to use. So we gave them to Ukraine to use. Now, some of those will have got shot down. Some of them will be picked apart by Russia to work out how they work. Some of them might find themselves on the black market. Does the West worry too much about that? No, because they're 30 years old. So the challenge, of course, is when we give Patriot missile systems to Ukraine, are we giving them the very latest version of the Patriot missile system? Because we could, but if we did that, Russia and China would be watching how those missiles work, watching where they're effective, watching where they're not effective, and they would learn about Western capability. Now, Patriots have been around for many decades. I think what's been very interesting is what model does Ukraine get, and also what little extras do we give them to help them on their way. So in answer to your question, how effective is Western air defense systems, the Patriot is probably one of the most effective missile systems around, but it's probably not the latest generation that Ukraine is able to have. Is it good enough to combat what's happening? Yes. Should you fire a $2 million missile to shoot down a $20,000 drone? No. Because these missiles, first of all, they're far too expensive, and secondly, you just can't produce them quickly enough. You need to save those for the really big targets. So what you actually need is a load of different systems that all come down to the simplest ones, the Shahed 136 drones, which are 120 miles an hour, fairly big. You can lie on your back with a machine gun and just shoot into the sky, and the thing flies into a wall of bullets. That's the way to shoot those down. So there's lots of different ways of shooting down the providing air defense umbrella, but the real question is the level of technology that's available to Ukraine. And however much we might lament it, it isn't going to be the very latest generation.
Do you think those guys who've been trained in the US and in Germany, those who operate this air defense system, have they proven to be effective so far with those limited, systems which were provided by the Western partners?
I think so. The feedback has been very positive. I think what for me, the interesting question has been that the Russian way of fighting is very attritional. It's just throw people at the fight. Horrible stories of the Vietnam War where the enemy would come at the American machine guns, knowing full well that you could fire 100 rounds out of the machine gun, then you had to change the ammunition. So throw 101 people at it, one will get through. That concept is not something the West. We had World War I, World War II, lost millions of people, and we decided that sort of brutal warfare is not the way we want to fight wars. We want to use technology to do a much more surgical strike so we protect our warfighters. Yes, they're still going to have to be on the battlefield, but that we do more to use technology to protect them. Russia isn't used to doing that. It's much more attritional. And the danger is Ukraine, because of its background, is also used to that attritional warfare. It's almost gladiatorial. There's some lovely phrases, which I won't insult the Ukrainians by trying to pronounce, but about their mythical gods on the battlefield. And it was about these huge giants that would take on each other. And, you call the Russians orcs. And it's just all this sort of battlefield mentality. How do you stop that? And the West's support to Ukraine, because that's not the way the West fights. We can hand over technology and weapons, but it isn't just about those weapons. It's how you use those weapons, how you are more agile, how you avoid lining up on a battlefield and just slugging it out, because that may have honor and it may be, honorable to slug it out on the battlefield. It's not how you win wars. these days.
Not anymore.
So trying to work out how you help Ukraine, it's not just about the weapons, it's also about how you use the weapons, what your doctrine is, how you fight your wars. And that's been, and this came very topical. Remember Bakhmut and the fight for, and at the time, Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner Group and prisoners being brought in, 30,000 deaths on the Russian side. Because Bakhmut suddenly became really symbolic, became symbolic for Putin. He wanted to show that he could take it and didn't care about how many people died. Now, the West criticized Zelensky at the time for getting involved in that battle because Ukraine lost a load of people as well. Now, after the event, I think it's probably, I can't second guess what Zelensky's tactics should be, but undoubtedly he forced Russia to lose lots of people, probably 10 times as many people as Ukraine lost, and all for a relatively small, tactically insignificant town, when actually Ukraine is worried about a much broader front line. So it probably made sense, but it was a really interesting philosophical question that how do you stop Ukraine getting dragged into this gladiatorial battle when actually that's exactly what Russia is trying to get Ukraine to do?
Yeah, but you see, when you hear Zelensky or any other general commanders from Ukrainian side, they say that leaving even a centimeter of Ukrainian land is painful, and they do their best to protect. Interesting enough, you mentioned this sort of like, cannon fodders. It's like dozens and dozens and dozens. One of my friends, he was at Bakhmut, and he was also the Operation Liberation Kharkiv, which we get there anyway. And he was saying he's one of those cold-hearted, treated as a job, with a sophisticated weapon. I don't want to lie, but there was like one night he put down about like 240 or something. And he's like, I got really tired. It's just like, no matter how experienced and prepared you are, it's just, they just come in and come in. Your fingers need to have rest, and they just never stop, and they just one on the top of another, and it's just like, even for them, it was surprising and something they were discussing.
No, and I say there are some benefits to that, but it's just horrible. It's horrible, the impact on human lives, but you have to fight the battle in front of you, and it's no doubt that one of the reasons we don't have a conscript army in this country is because we think there is value in having a professional army that not only knows how to survive on the battlefield, but also follows the law of armed conflict, makes sure the Geneva Convention. The problem with having prisoners fighting or conscripts, they don't want to be there. And as evidence is emerging from the way the Russians are fighting, is that you don't respect the law of armed conflict. You do unspeakably nasty things. And now some would say it's a war. Why could you have rules in war? Well, yes, but don't forget, when even in the Second World War, on Christmas Day, the soldiers stopped fighting and played football with each other because they didn't hate each other. They were sent there on behalf of their politicians to do their political will. Yes, it's awful and fighting, but if you out of respect for humanity, I come from the Royal Air Force. When we shot down one of the German aircraft, we would take the pilot to the officers' mess, we would give him a meal and toast him with a glass of wine or a beer before he went off to prison. Out of respect, because he was a gladiator in the air, and out of respect, he lost that particular battle, but you drink his toast. He was operating on behalf of his Air Force. You were operating on behalf of yours. You weren't there to kill him. You were there to win. And out of respect for the fact that both of you had a profession to do on the battlefield. So there are some interesting cultures around all of this.
It is. It's something to surprise me. And it always surprises me. When I was last year, this sort of June last year, I was in Pokrovsk, and I was staying with the Ukrainian positions, and I was sort of with the guys who fighting with the medic, and she was saying there's when the prisoners were taken and they needed some medical help. And I think there was the Wagner's, the prisoners or something. And their eyes were covered, so they didn't see her, but they sort of like sensed there was a woman, and they sort of trying to talk to her or something. And she says, it's like, I focused on the wound. I did it. I didn't want to do anything, with them, and no talking, no anything, while they were trying sort of like to show their human side. And she's like, no, this is my civilized response to you. You need help. Please get it, and goodbye. And the other guys, those, the experience, they going through the really hard and unbelievable things for me as a civilian. And when I ask them, and they sort of like the same as you, there's these are the challenging, enemies. This is like not a good enemy, or this is the enemy doesn't deserve respect. And as a civilian, and I feel so angry, and I sort of sometimes I think, war crime committing. It's not like I'm encouraging or anything, but it's just your emotions, and you're just shaking of them. But I've never seen even a slightly similar attitude among Ukrainian servicemen or servicewomen I was speaking to. It was just enemy. This is the victory, and we are humans. We behave in the human way. There was something fascinating.
I know, and it's something we could spend ages talking about this. I don't know if you've seen the film Saving Private Ryan.
Of course I did.
Yeah, so admittedly there's lots of artistic license, but when the Allied soldiers were trying to get a beach hold, and there were Germans with machine gun nests literally killing hundreds of people, when they finally got up and found those and got to the machine gun nests, do you A, take those German prisoners, or B, you've watched them kill hundreds of your friends? Are you just going to kill them on the spot? And it's a philosophical question, because from a legal perspective, of course you should take them prisoner or whatever. But the brutality of war, what actually happens is people respond to their visceral reaction to that. I think a professional military, as we found in Afghanistan and we found in Iraq, is that if you don't operate as a professional military, you might win the war but lose the peace. So you have to operate within a structure and a framework of legality. What has been pretty clear from areas that Ukrainians have liberated is that the Russian forces haven't done that at all. And the danger, of course, is once one side starts to commit atrocities, history suggests that both sides start to do it. They both rush to the bottom in terms of standards. And it's very difficult to pass judgment. I've been involved in war. I know what the legal perspective is, but most people who define the legal perspective have never been involved themselves. They've never seen the impact of war. They've never seen some of the horrible sights you see in war. And I became somewhat immune to it. The only time it really affected me was in my year I spent a year in Kabul, and when you saw children dead, and it triggered something in me that always had me very emotional. Whereas, having seen so much of war, you become a bit more immune to everything else in it. And that's why the Ukrainian soldiers, they're doing an amazing job. But the more they get battle hardened, the more they don't stop. They can operate despite the fear, despite the adrenaline. But it's an awful situation that both sides find themselves in. And the demons that will come back to haunt the Ukrainians, of those hundreds of people that have died, watching their friends get killed or badly injured. It's the horrors of war, and it's not one day. We're now into 2.5 years of this.
You see, when you're saying it's like both sides suffer, it's not really fair. I mean, I understand we have the numbers of those who died, but you don't attack if you don't want to die. If you come with a weapon on somebody else's territory, so you expect it to be dead. You performing. Those people. Okay, let's take it of Butterfield. the person who broke in, or the person who raped, or the person who killed, are we talking about his challenges or his... obviously, he maybe didn't come from he in some dark place. Let's talk about his issues. Let's sort of like what pushed him into this position. So we actually act according to legislative system and put them in a special place. So battlefield, similar but different. You see, there's like, when it comes to crime in civilian life, there's black and there's white. But when, especially in the West, the discussions like, oh, both sides are suffering. So there's one side is a villain and the other side is trying not to be eaten.
No, I agree with you. And I think we've got to be very clear here to separate this out. Most military soldiers are not there because they want to be there.
Yeah, they want to be with families.
They want to be with their families. Yeah. They don't want to die on the battlefield, but they are told to go there by their political masters.
Yeah.
And therefore, that is why both sides played football at Christmas on the battlefields, because
but it's not relevant for
No. But it's a demonstration that you have a job to do. So the Russians have a job to do. They may well have to create a vision of what of hatred around the Ukrainians to be able to do what they do. But most militaries, to my knowledge, they don't choose to be there. They're being told to be there. They didn't sign up and go, yes, I'd like to go to Ukraine to fight. They're being told a different story. They're being told that Ukraine is a threat. The Nazis in the east of Ukraine are a threat to us. NATO's a threat to us. They're serving their country. They're being told to go and do a dreadful job. So when it comes to the battles themselves, now the Ukrainians, the huge difference here is the Ukrainians aren't just there because they're being told to be there. They're also there because they want to be there. They want to defend their country, their people, their families, their children. There's a passion there, whereas I think a lot of the Russians were told this was a war, we're just going to liberate all of our Russian colleagues. Then they see what's actually happening on the ground. And the danger is that you'll probably have heard of barricade forces. So the Russians have a whole line of their forces behind the front line, and they're told to shoot their own soldiers if they turn and run. And that's just... Now, suddenly you find it's your son is now on the battlefield. He didn't want to be there. He's now fighting, but he's got a line of people behind him that are going to shoot him if he turns around. Now, I'm not trying to create sympathy for Russian soldiers. What I'm saying is that both sides are suffering in different ways, and it's the people who put them into that situation. Our political masters sent us into Iraq. Our political masters sent us into Afghanistan. For a different podcast, I get incredibly frustrated that so many British lives were lost in Afghanistan when our political masters hadn't thought through what we were there to do. We served our country, but we didn't want to be fighting in Afghanistan. We lost a lot of lives there, and without having the robust political environment to do that. So the people I blame here are Putin. He's the one accountable for this. He's the one responsible for...
But Putin is the symptom of the society. You see,
quite possibly.
And Putin is not the one who was committing those war crimes in Bucha. Putin wasn't the one... I mean, he's the evil. He is the monster. But after Kharkiv region was liberated, the mass graves... the atrocities were committed to children for mothers and fathers to watch in the Kiev region, which we don't know what's happening.
All those things are war crimes, and absolutely. My point is that if you have professional soldiers who are trained, they are aware of the law of armed conflict, and they're less likely to do those atrocities. When you have an army that isn't a professional army, those sorts of atrocities, unfortunately, happen, and they should be punished. The mass graves is an interesting one. So in war, you end up with a lot of people getting killed. What do you do with the bodies? Now, in an ideal world, you'd dig individual graves and you'd mark them all or whatever. That all takes time. Often in warfare, you don't have that time. Now, again, I'm not saying mass graves are the answer, but... that is not necessarily a war crime. The war crimes, the rapes and the dreadful treatment and the...
Yeah, but
People
how many people were tied with their
No,
hands?
and that is the
tortured
war
with
crime.
That's what. For example, for ITV, there was a story I was producing when there was disclosed the basement, and there were 6 men, and they were with evidence of torture, and they were all killed. So, and we did the story, and we were connecting with their families and everything. So, it's not Putin who was there.
No,
you know, it's just.
But he's responsible ultimately.
He is.
Because actually, if you don't have professional military, so in the World War II, we had a lot of soldiers who went mentally unstable because they were so scared because they knew they were going to die. And each day, if they survived, they'd go and they had a couple of days off. They would go back, they would get stormingly drunk. They would rape because they just thought this was the end of their days. Now, I'm not suggesting it's right. I'm just saying that it's very difficult to put yourself in. You're describing the Russian soldiers, piles of bodies as people just throwing themselves at that. The people who are there but survive that, many of them are mentally destroyed as a result of it. And if they don't have the proper training, I'm not absolving them. They absolutely should be punished for their war crimes. But they shouldn't be there badly trained. They shouldn't be thrown at the front as cannon fodder. That is their military commanders and ultimately Putin's responsibility. It doesn't mean either or, but if you go study through history, people who are fighting on battlefields, it isn't glamorous like it often appears in the war movies. It's awful. And different people react. Some people break down. Some people just mentally are destroyed. Some people just say, I'm going to die in the next few days, so I'm going to live my life fully while I'm here. I'm going to, and that can twist people, do some unspeakable things. And absolutely, they should be punished for that. And the war crimes that Butcher and others, absolutely, that needs to be punished. But it isn't just their fault. It is also, you follow back the trail of breadcrumbs, that they shouldn't have been there. The prisoners who were released, given 5 days of training, and then go out into the battlefields. How on earth have they had the training to understand what their responsibilities are? They're just fighting a war of survival. They'll kill anybody that comes in their way. They will commit all sorts of dreadful atrocities. Now, it's their fault, but they've never been trained properly to do that task. Therefore, there's a degree of responsibility and accountability on those that send them into that battlefield, knowing full well that they will not discharge their legal responsibilities because they've never been trained.
Yeah, I see this side. But just, when I hear this expression, it's like both sides suffer. I understand the sentiment, someone who is not emotionally involved. But I'm just saying, there's one of these, like making it actively enjoying themselves doing unspeakable things. So now,
yes,
as I mentioned a few times before, I have friends in different parts of the Ukraine armed forces. There's one of them who just helped me to prepare to talk to you.
Uh-oh.
So I'm going to use the things and the name of the weapons. I have no idea. But I hope for the viewers it's going to be interesting, as I expect you would know what does it mean. So, US effectively implemented so-called FrankenSAM projects, at least some of them, integrating Western missiles into Soviet legacy A systems. And what's your take of those projects? Is there potential to create such project using different missiles such as RAM-162 or RAM-66 standard MR? Does it make any sense?
No. So I'm sure we'll do another one of these. And when we do, any of those sort of things, I can do a bit of research beforehand.
Okay, we're just skipping.
No, but I think in principle, what's fascinating, you touched on it before, there are fundamental differences between what the West does and what Russia does. So artillery, literally just a piece firing around 10 kilometers, doesn't sound very sexy, but generally that kills more and injures more people on the battlefield than anything else. Russia stockpiled millions of rounds of ammunition, but they use 152 millimeter diameter rounds. The West, because it wants to have NATO and standard, has 155 millimeter rounds. Only 3 millimeters difference, but you can't use one in the other. And therefore, one of the challenges how you support Ukraine was, do you provide them with 152 millimeter ammunition so that they can use their weapons? But not many places in the West build 152 millimeter. Or do you provide them 155 millimeter ammunition, but then you have to provide them with the guns as well and all the support infrastructure behind them, and they have to learn how to fire them. Now, at the start of the conflict, it was thought it was better just to give them 152 millimeter rounds, use your own equipment. The problem with artillery firing is that because the Russians have millions of these rounds, a little chap, a Russian soldier who's next to his gun, sits there with his cigarette all day, loads a round into the gun, fires it, loads another one, fires it, spends all day just firing these rounds. Endless pile of rounds, just sits there quietly. And Ukraine does the same back. What the West does is they use technology. So they have counter-battery radar. So in effect, both sides have it, but the West has a much better version of it. So when you fire your round, my radar picks up that round, follows it, and predicts where it's going to land. But it also works backwards and knows exactly where it was fired from. So it now tells that to my artillery piece. So I get my artillery piece lined up exactly, and I fire 3 rounds straight back at you. So all of a sudden now, rather than all day, fire. As soon as he fires 1 round, within a minute, 3 rounds are firing back directly at his position. What do you think that impact has on the Russian? What am I going to do today? I'm going to see if I can fire 2,000 rounds out of this gun. Now, he's going to load 1 round up, put a very long bit of string to the trigger, go a long way away, pull it, and then hide for a while. So the number of rounds that are going to come towards Ukraine diminishes significantly. And that's where Western technology makes a huge difference on the battlefield. And the question is, can you link that counter-battery radar to a former Ukrainian bit of kit? You can, but it's quite difficult to do. Nothing talks to each other in the way that it should do. It's not designed to operate with that bit of kit. Does it matter? Well, if Russia's got millions of rounds, it doesn't need to fire them accurately. If Ukraine doesn't have millions of rounds, the ones it does have, it wants to fire accurately. So it sort of makes sense. That's where technology can make a huge difference on the battlefield. And it's just interesting to see there's lots of examples of that where the Russian just fire, throw people over the front. There's a different way of doing it.
Well, this is proved very effectively, isn't it? So now it's going to be probably challenging for you. But I hope you're up to this challenge because, as I mentioned, I sort of like looking as a civilian. I won 1 game changer, victory for Ukraine, and happy clappy world again. So let's speculate, like look back. So it's 2.5 years of big war already and 10 years since Russian invasion. Are there the moments in this war already which could have been, the history could go the other way? For example, when I was thinking and reflecting on it, I was thinking, do you remember Zelensky reply? He's like, I don't need a ride, I need a weapon.
Yes.
So I think because Ukraine had already a president who escaped, and so this president stand with his people and still defending. Yes. So that there's one sort of game changer moment could have been. The other thing is I think it's a loss of Mariupol and defending Kiev. There are those moments. So if we still had Mariupol, I think it would be different, don't you? Or it was a matter of time. And obviously if Kiev was captured, we would be talking different stories and, you know, probably the war would be different. Successful counteroffensive in Kharkiv region and liberation of Kherson. So non-military person says, F-16 in Ukrainian sky. And military person said, no chance. So what are your sort of like these moments which we already lived through could have been a game changer? And we can speculate if we know how it's happened already, but if it hasn't or went other way.
Yeah, I'm always a bit nervous about... Professor Michael Clark and I did a lot of work together at Sky, and he was a historical guy. So he loved looking back in history and saying, well, if you'd done this then, this wouldn't have happened. Whereas as a military guy, you tend to look and go, yes, but based on the information you had available at the time, it felt like the right thing to do. History, when you look back on it, for all sorts of other reasons it didn't work, would that have changed your mind about if you could go back, would you do it differently? And I think, but there are some things, I think, so the one that I would hook up on is the spring offensive. One of the things about military operations is generally you want an element of surprise. You talked about the Kursk, operation caught Russia completely off guard. The spring offensive, at the risk of sounding trivial, if you go back to the end of the year before, Ukraine had successfully liberated 13,000 square kilometers of land up to the north around Kharkiv. And Zelensky effectively said, give me the weapons and we can kick Russia out of the whole of Ukraine. I'm being simplistic, but and the West went, but eventually said, okay, what's your shopping list? But that was all played out in the media. And spring, as you know, it's not about the season, it's about when the land
Weather. Yeah.
dries enough and you can have manoeuvre so everybody isn't locked onto roads. And that was probably about March, April time, maybe a little bit later. But Ukraine wasn't ready to start that offensive until June, July time. And the danger is that because it all appeared in the media, so President Putin and his military were able to look in big handfuls and go, right, blow the Kharkovka Dam so you can't come at me across the Dnipro River. The Donbass, it's quite difficult. That's not where I would choose. So you're most likely to be doing it around Zaporizhia and just to the east. That seems the most likely area. So I'm going to take the time to build a 3-layered defense system, with dragon's teeth, with trenches, and with minefields. And Russia did that very effectively. Yeah. And we were, as the days turned to weeks, turned to months, we were going, when's this offensive going to start? And Russia was going, they couldn't believe their luck because it didn't start straight away, because if it had started straight away, it was really difficult to lay minefields when the ground is frozen solid. Now the ground isn't frozen solid. Now it's easy to lay minefields. It's easy to dig ditches. It's easy to put the dragon's teeth. And when that offensive started, despite Ukraine's best efforts, it failed. And not only failed, Ukraine lost a lot of people. It lost a lot of equipment. And ever since then, Russia's been on the front foot. And it raised some really difficult questions, I think, for the West, because the West, in effect, said, okay, Zelensky, you can have whatever you want. He got whatever he wanted and still didn't move the front line. And the West turns around and says, well, first of all, we don't have any more weapons of that number available. And secondly, even if we did, what are you going to do with them? We're prolonging a war because you couldn't break through. We're prolonging a war that's just, we're contributing to this illusion that Ukraine will liberate its land. And therefore, are we being stupid, West? And I think psychologically that created a real problem for the West. So I think for me, that spring offensive held so much promise. And it's not a criticism of Zelensky. There's a whole bundle of reasons why it was delayed. But as a military guy, by telling your enemy what you're going to do and effectively where you're going to do it, gave Russia a lot of time to prepare. And ultimately, Ukraine failed.
Do you know, it's interesting because as a journalist, I remember this sort of like, happily drunken, not literally drunken, but, with the excitement, with this liberation, Kharkiv first. And it was so funny because we were with the crew in Ukraine and we arrived the beginning of September and there was like media blackout. Nobody wants to talk anything. They don't tell you anything. You are not allowed to go anywhere. And we were there in the hotel, supposedly to produce something, which absolutely impossible situation. And then I suggested editor, because one of my friends in intelligence said, we can take you to Kharkiv. And my editor, no, everything's going to happen in Kherson. We are not interested in Kharkiv. It's like, but this is our chance. Let's go. Kharkiv is not interested. A few days later, Kharkiv, here and there. And obviously that you're at the end of everyone because, you haven't been there. And we missed this chance. Kherson, I was already in London. And one of the crews, I don't know if you're aware, there was a scandal because Ukrainian authorities, when there was the liberation and clearance, when actually sort of like semi-safe to go there, they wanted to be President Zelensky first and then the media and everything. But obviously media, eager to and thirsty to anything, they drove first. And we all remember the footage and video. And then all those crews who victoriously entered Kharkiv were banned from armed forces accreditation. There was a headache, which was resolved later. And I remember the sort of feeling in the newsrooms, like I was, being honest with you, I was scared because I knew the price. I talked to guys on the front line. For me, it was just, I know how many people we lost now to tick the box of these victories and how it was planned. And one of the episodes I was sort of covering the Kharkiv liberation, and they were so lucky, and it wasn't easy. They were so hard. And one of the most experienced officers of the defense intelligence, and he was saying about Kharkiv liberation, he said, it was hell on earth. They were covered us with everything. And he said, we were sure we're going to stay there forever. But still defending. So, but after the liberation and after this victories, I think there was sort of like more media, pressurizing, like, give us more victory, give us more dynamic, give us more reasons to cover and give the story. Because when the war is very quiet, when dynamic doesn't go either way, it's difficult to produce the stories which would be relevant and interesting for the wide
I think the West needed to, you've got a David versus Goliath battle. Goliath is the big Russian bear, and practically the West was going, you've done a great job to stop Russia, but defeating Russia when you're a much smaller nation, how's that going to happen? And Kharkiv was just an example of Zelensky turn around and say, look, we can clear these orcs out of Ukraine. You just got to give us the tools. And the West went, oh, okay, maybe you're right. So I do think, but the very fact the pendulum swung that way means it also swings back the other way. Mm-hmm. And so that's one. And the other one I reflect is that the West was reluctant to support Ukraine initially. And I'm not trying to justify why, but Ukraine wasn't a member of NATO. Every nation operates in its own national interest. Getting involved in a conflict with a major superpower has all sorts of implications. And bluntly, I think a lot of the West thought Ukraine would fall pretty quickly. Yeah. But if you look back with the benefit of hindsight, it's taken us 2.5 years to get to the point where we've given F-16s. It took a year and a half before we gave tanks. It gave almost 2 years before we gave long-range missiles. If you look back with the benefit of hindsight, if we'd done some of this earlier, would it have had a different impact on the battlefield? And then look forward and say, so what are the things that the West is not doing today that it will be doing in a year's time? And why don't we start doing those now? And one of those is things like air power, putting in a no-fly zone into Ukraine. Because, okay, I'm a former fighter pilot, but you struggle to look for examples in history where a military without an air force is able to prevail on the battlefields. You need air power to provide that umbrella for your forces to operate. And if you don't have it, it's devastating. I don't want to bore you with examples, but Ukraine trying to do what it's doing without air power, I'm not belittling what it has, but it's pinpricks. It's not able to dominate, and therefore it's amazing that they've done as well as they have without the air power. And philosophically, I do understand all the reasons why the West has not done it, but philosophically, you can't be a little bit pregnant. You either help or you don't. And Putin has been very effective at scaring the West into not getting involved. I'll start a nuclear war. And the fact is that every time the West has stepped, Putin is not going to start a nuclear war over this. He might if the West invades Russia, but he's not going to do it in Ukraine. But he's caused enough doubt in Western leaders, so they've all been reluctant to go. And the West, we had to lead on tanks. We probably led on the F-16 conversation, long-range missiles we were leading, gradually America's joined. But the question I think, and I've asked some of our ministers that, is would we be prepared to see Ukraine fail and not put in Western air power, or would we put Western air power in to stop Ukraine failing? And if you were asked that question 2 years ago, there's no chance. You ask that question today, and it's more, well, I don't think we're quite ready to. So I think because philosophically, with more and more support going to Ukraine, there is a question that says, if it's inevitable that without Western support, Ukraine would fall, and if Ukraine fell, Putin would be rewarded for aggression, where would that leave the world? Where would that leave Xi Jinping and Taiwan? Where would that leave North Korea? So can the West afford to leave this conflict in a way that rewards aggression? Because that would compromise international security and therefore our own security. And therefore, how far are you prepared to go to make sure that Putin cannot win? Doesn't mean he has to lose, but can't win, whatever that means. And I think that's a really interesting question philosophically for the West discuss.
Well, I just keep fingers crossed. Sean, thank you very much.
You are very welcome.
Such a pleasure, such an honor to have such guests like you. You know, it's just the truth has been absolutely brilliant, fantastic, endless pleasure. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your time. And I'm so endlessly grateful for all your comments, for your likes, for your shares. I like the discussions we have in the comments. Sometimes I'm not involved, but I'll try to answer all your comments. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being. And you're such an amazing community. I'm Jenny Klochko, and today I talked to Sean Bell. And please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Have a great day.